The Buddha, also known as Siddhartha Gotama or Siddhartha Gautama or Buddha Shakyamuni, was a philosopher, mendicant, meditator, spiritual teacher, and religious leader who lived in ancient India, 5th to 4th century BCE. He is revered as the founder of the world religion of Buddhism, and worshipped by most Buddhist schools as the Enlightened One who has transcended karma and escaped the cycle of birth and rebirth. He taught for around 45 years and built a large following, both monastic and lay. His teaching is based on his insight into dukkha, typically translated as suffering, and the end of dukkha, the state called Nibbāna or Nirvana. The Buddha was born into an aristocratic family in the Shakya clan but eventually renounced lay life. According to Buddhist tradition, after several years of mendicancy, meditation, and asceticism, he awakened to understand the mechanism which keeps people trapped in the cycle of rebirth. The Buddha then traveled throughout the Ganges plain teaching and building a religious community. The Buddha taught a middle way between sensual indulgence and the severe asceticism found in the Indian Rama movement. He taught a spiritual path that included ethical training and meditative practices such as jhana and mindfulness. The Buddha also critiqued the practices of Brahmin priests, such as animal sacrifice. A couple of centuries after his death he came to be known by the title Buddha, which means awakened one or enlightened one. Gautama's teachings were compiled by the Buddhist community in the suttas, which contain his discourses, and the Vinaya, his codes for monastic practice. These were passed down in Middle Indo-Aryan dialects through an oral tradition. Later generations composed additional texts, such as systematic treatises known as Abhidharma, biographies of the Buddha, collections of stories about the Buddha's past lives known as Jataka tales, and additional discourses, the Mahayana Sutras. Besides Buddha and the name Siddhartha, he was also known by other names and titles, such as Shakyamuni, sage of the Shakyas. In the early texts, the Buddha also often refers to himself as Tathagata. The term is often thought to mean either one who has thus gone or one who has thus come, possibly referring to the transcendental nature of the Buddha's spiritual attainment. A common list of epithets are commonly seen together in the canonical texts, and depict some of his spiritual qualities. Samasambuddho, perfectly self-awakened. Vijakarana Sampano, endowed with higher knowledge and ideal conduct. Shugato, well-gone or well-spoken. Lokavida, knower of the many worlds. Anuttaro Purusatama Sarati, unexcelled trainer of untrained people. Sathadeva Manasanam, teacher of gods and humans. Bhagavatha, the blessed one. Araham, worthy of homage. An arahant is one with taints destroyed, who has lived the holy life, done what had to be done, laid down the burden, reached the true goal, destroyed the fetters of being, and is completely liberated through final knowledge. Jina, conqueror. Although the term is more commonly used to name an individual who has attained liberation in the religion Jainism, it is also an alternative title for the Buddha. The Pali Canon also contains numerous other titles and epithets for the Buddha, including all-seeing, all-transcending sage, bull among men, the caravan leader, dispeller of darkness, the eye, foremost of charioteers, foremost of those who can cross, king of the Dharma, Dharmaraja, kinsman of the sun, helper of the world, Lokanatha, lion, Siha, lord of the Dhamma, of excellent wisdom, Varapanna, radiant one, torch-bearer of mankind, unsurpassed doctor and surgeon, victor in battle, and wielder of power. Scholars are hesitant to make unqualified claims about the historical facts of the Buddha's life. Most people accept that the Buddha lived, taught, and founded a monastic order during the Mahajanapata era during the reign of Bimbisara, the ruler of the Magadha Empire, and died during the early years of the reign of Ajatashatru, who was the successor of Bimbisara, thus making him a younger contemporary of Mahavira, the Jain Tirthankara. While the general sequence of birth, maturity, renunciation, search, awakening, and liberation teaching, death is widely accepted, there is less consensus on the veracity of many details contained in traditional biographies. The times of Gautama's birth and death are uncertain. Most historians in the early 20th century dated his lifetime as within the Eastern Buddhist tradition of China, Vietnam, Korea, and Japan. The traditional date for the death of the Buddha was 949 BC. According to the Khotan system of time calculation in the Kalachakra tradition, Buddha is believed to have died about 833 BCE. More recently, his death is dated later, between 411 and 400 BCE, while at a symposium on this question held in 1988, the majority of those who presented definite opinions gave dates within 20 years either side of 400 BCE for the Buddha's death. These alternative chronologies, however, have not been accepted by all historians. According to the Buddhist tradition, Gautama was born in Lumbini, now in modern-day Nepal, and raised in Kapilvastu, which may have been either in what is present-day Tilorakot, Nepal, or Piparwa, India. According to Buddhist tradition, he obtained his enlightenment in Bodh Gaya, gave his first sermon in Sarnath, and died in Kushan Agar. One of Gautama's usual names was Sakyamuni or Sakyamun, sage of the Shakyas. This and the evidence of the early texts suggests that he was born into the Shakya clan, a community that was on the periphery, both geographically and culturally, of the eastern Indian subcontinent in the 5th century BCE. The community was either a small republic, or an oligarchy. His father was an elected chieftain, or oligarch. Bronkhorst calls this Eastern culture Greater Magadha and notes that Buddhism and Jainism arose in a culture which was recognized as being non-Vedic. The Shakyas were an Eastern sub-Himalayan ethnic group who were considered outside of the Raivarta and of mixed origin, say Krayonia, possibly part Aryan and part indigenous. The laws of Manu treats them as being non-Aryan. As noted by Levman, the Bodhi-Yanadur master lists all the tribes of Magadha as being outside the pale of the Raivarta, and just visiting them required a purificatory sacrifice as expiation. This is confirmed by the Ambaha Sutta, where the Sakyans are said to be rough-spoken, of menial origin and criticized because they do not honor, respect, esteem, revere, or pay homage to Brahmins. Some of the non-Vedic practices of this tribe included incest, marrying their sisters, the worship of trees, tree spirits, and nagas. According to Levman, while the Sakyans' rough speech and Munda ancestors do not prove that they spoke a non-Indo-Aryan language, there is a lot of other evidence suggesting that they were indeed a separate ethnic, and probably linguistic, group. Christopher I. Beckwith identifies the Shakyas as Scythians. Apart from the Vedic Brahmins, the Buddha's lifetime coincided with the flourishing of influential Rama schools of thought like Jaivika, Krivka, Jainism, and Ajnana. Brahmajala Sutta records 62 such schools of thought. In this context, a Rama refers to one who labors, toils, or exerts themselves, for some higher or religious purpose. It was also the age of influential thinkers like Mahavira, Prakasapa, Maghali Gosla, Ashitaka Pakudha and Sanjaya Balahaputa, as recorded in Samanaphala Sutta, whose viewpoints the Buddha most certainly must have been acquainted with. Indeed, Riputra and Moggallana, two of the foremost disciples of the Buddha, were formerly the foremost disciples of Sanjaya Balahaputa, the skeptic, and the Pali Canon frequently depicts Buddha engaging in debate with the adherents of rival schools of thought. There is also philological evidence to suggest that the two masters, Alara Kalama and Adakarmaputa, were indeed historical figures, and they most probably taught Buddha two different forms of meditative techniques. Thus, Buddha was just one of the many Rama philosophers of that time. In an era where holiness of person was judged by their level of asceticism, Buddha was a reformist within the Rama movement, rather than a reactionary against Vedic Brahmanism. Historically, The life of the Buddha also coincided with the Achaemenid conquest of the Indus Valley during the rule of Darius from about 516 BCE. This Achaemenid occupation of the areas of Gandhara and Sind, which lasted about 2 centuries, was accompanied by the introduction of Achaemenid religions, Reformed Mazdaism or early Zoroastrianism, to which Buddhism might have in part reacted. In particular, the ideas of the Buddha may have partly consisted of a rejection of the absolutist or perfectionist ideas contained in these Achaemenid religions. The main narrative of the Buddha's last days, death, and the events following his death is contained in the Mahaparinibbana Sutta and its various parallels in Sanskrit, Chinese, and Tibetan. According to Analayo, these include the Chinese Durga Agama Sanskrit fragments of the Mahaparinirvana Sutra, and 3 discourses preserved as individual translations in Chinese. The Mahaparinibbana Sutta depicts the Buddha's last year as a time of war. It begins with Ajatasattu's decision to make war on the Vajjan Federation, leading him to send a minister to ask the Buddha for advice. The Buddha responds by saying that the Vajjans can be expected to prosper as long as they do 7 things, and he then applies these 7 principles to the Buddhist Sangha, showing that he is concerned about its future welfare. The Buddha says that the Sangha will prosper as long as they hold regular and frequent assemblies, meet in harmony, do not change the rules of training, honor their superiors who were ordained before them, do not fall prey to worldly desires, remain devoted to forest hermitages, and preserve their personal mindfulness. He then gives further lists of important virtues to be upheld by the Sangha. After traveling and teaching some more, the Buddha ate his last meal, which he had received as an offering from a blacksmith named Kunda. Falling violently ill, Buddha instructed his attendant Nanda to convince Kunda that the meal eaten at his place had nothing to do with his death and that his meal would be a source of the greatest merit as it provided the last meal for a Buddha. Pico and von Heineber argue that the Buddha died of mesenteric infarction, a symptom of old age, rather than food poisoning. The precise contents of the Buddha's final meal are not clear, due to variant scriptural traditions and ambiguity over the translation of certain significant terms. The Theravada tradition generally believes that the Buddha was offered some kind of pork, while the Mahayana tradition believes that the Buddha consumed some sort of truffle or other mushroom. These may reflect the different traditional views on Buddhist vegetarianism and the precepts for monks and nuns. Modern scholars also disagree on this topic, arguing both for pig's flesh or some kind of plant or mushroom that pigs like to eat. Whatever the case, none of the sources which mention the last meal attribute the Buddha's sickness to the meal itself. As per the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, after the meal with Kunda, the Buddha and his companions continued traveling until he was too weak to continue and had to stop at Kushinagar, where Nanda had a resting place prepared in a grove of solid trees. After announcing to the Sangha at large that he would soon be passing away to final nirvana, the Buddha ordained one last novice into the order personally. His name was Subhada. He then repeated his final instructions to the Sangha, which was that the Dhamma and Vinaya was to be their teacher after his death. Then he asked if anyone had any doubts about the teaching, but nobody did. The Buddha's final words are reported to have been, Al Sagris Dukkha. Strive for the goal with diligence, Apam Da, Pali, Vayadham Sigrapam Dina Samdith. He then entered his final meditation and died, reaching what is known as pari-nirvana, final nirvana, the end of rebirth and suffering achieved after the death of the body. The Mahaparinibbana reports that in his final meditation he entered the 4 dhyanas consecutively, then the 4 immaterial attainments and finally the meditative dwelling known as Nara Sampati, before returning to the 4th dhyana right at the moment of death.